Greetings. Welcome to our session on bringing the work home. I am Susan Reichley. I am the president and CEO of the International Youth Foundation, and I am thrilled to welcome all of you and to have you join our extraordinary panelists for I know what is going to be a fascinating discussion, particularly today, given everything everyone has endured over this past year with the pandemic, with lockdowns, with a lot of misinformation, a lot of incredible movements that are happening around the world. The social justice movements as a result that really sprung to life here in the US as a result of George Floyd's murder. We have seen a tremendous amount of things happen over this last year, and I'm just thrilled that we have an opportunity to sort of step back and really think about the issues that we've been grappling with, from the health crises to inequality to human rights to disinformation, that these are universal issues that we are grappling with. And these are things that are enshrined within the Sustainable Development Goals. They are universal. These are universal issues. And yet there is often a divide in the policy discussions. Here in Washington or around the world, the international discussions around these issues and the domestic policy discussions around these issues. Often these conversations are happening in silos. And today we have an opportunity to really bridge those silos, to break down those silos, and to talk about these issues in a way for NGOs in particular who are grappling with the fact of can we and should we be addressing these challenges here in the US? How do we break down or bridge the silos? Are we really moving away from a paradigm of international development and domestic development? Something that I actually feel very strongly that we're moving towards global development. And often it's young people, young professionals who are no longer seeing the world in terms of global north and global south. And so we have an opportunity to hear from this fantastic panel today who have been working across the lines and across these spheres for some time. I first want to introduce Jeannie Burgot. You have everybody's bios, so I'm not going to go into depth, but Jeannie and I had the good fortune of meeting almost 30 years ago. It's hard to believe when we were both young Foreign Service officers at the U.S. Agency for International Development, and she's gone on to lead InterNews over the last 20 years. And for those of you who don't know InterNews, it has worked around the globe, as you heard, on really these issues of independent media and tackling disinformation around the globe. And they've just recently chosen to work over the last couple of years here in the US. So look forward to hearing Jeannie's insights and reflections. I also welcome Tony Pippa, another old friend I had an opportunity to work with more than 10 years ago and continued at the USAID when he was the Chief Strategy Officer, and he also led the US government as the special coordinator in the post-2015 agenda, and now is at the Brookings Institute, and has been really diving into this rural-urban divide that we often see not only internationally, but here in the US. So really excited to dive into Tony's reflections on these issues and the lessons. Sakira Cook, I've just had an opportunity to meet you most recently and welcome you to the panel because you have just a tremendous amount of experience as the Senior Director of Justice Reform on the Leadership Conference of Human Rights, as well as the Leadership Conference in Education, and working on really, really tough issues here in the US, but also seeing that relationship with the international community and how to influence the international discussions on this issue. So welcome. And finally, Maria Stefan, it's just wonderful to have you as an expert in nonviolent movement building, and had an opportunity recently to dive into some of your most recent writings about non-movement, social movement building across the globe, and a lot of lessons, it seems, both internationally in the US, that again really challenges this paradigm of breaking down the divide. So why don't we just dive into the discussion right now? And I'd love for each of you to really provide some thoughts and reflections and lessons that you all have from decades. I mean, I was adding it up. We're over a century of experience here around the table. And I know that everyone watching would love to hear a bit about your lessons from your work, wherever you've worked, internationally or here in the US, or again, crossing the lines, particularly about where you think we're at and what can be useful to our audience. Many of our NGOs who have traditionally focused on international work and thinking about the work here at home. And Jeannie, I'd like to start with you. As I mentioned, obviously, InterNews has made the decision to really start working here in the US. And perhaps this past year, more than ever, the importance of independent evidence-based information has been more important than ever. And so if you can share with us a little bit of the story of, what inspired InterNews to make this big leap into working in the US after decades of only focusing internationally, and what are some of the lessons you'd like to share with us?
Great, thank you. And it's lovely to be on this panel with everyone. This is a really exciting conversation for me personally, and I think for our sector generally. So we started looking domestically. Actually, it isn't with the rise of disinformation in the last few years of how messy our information environment has become in the United States. It started way before then in the media and information sector, particularly with the rise of the internet and the collapse of the news industry. And as we've watched around the country, we've been losing newspapers, radio stations, television stations all over the country because the news industry is really under a lot of stress because there's so many other news sources of information. There's good and bad to that, but it has caused a rise of information deserts around the country. And two pieces came together for us as we were looking at this question. One, it was years ago watching when Hurricane Katrina hit New Orleans and seeing so many people with such desperate need for information. And I was thinking, well, of course, the media will be able to reach everybody where they are. And of course, we know that didn't happen. And that was just a devastating thing to see and realize, wow, we've got the tools that could have helped that situation and didn't even think to deploy them there. Fast forward a few years, we were asked to come to New Orleans, and there was a radio station there that was really interested in building a news. It was WWNO in New Orleans, the public radio station. They were setting up a news program there, and really wanted to make sure that they were reaching all neighborhoods of New Orleans. But they didn't have the resources to do. They were wildly under-resourced for a news program, not surprising. So they reached out to us and said, we've heard about some of the work you do. How would you recommend we do this? And it was amazing for us to be able to come in and sort of say, there's lots of really innovative approaches to engaging in communities and really building stories, bubbling stories up from the ground that will really help enrich your news programming. And that partnership spawned what we call now our Listening Post Collective. And since then, we started that work in earnest in 2013. We've now worked in over 70 communities around the country as they seek to either fill an information desert or to reach communities, if news organizations are trying to expand their reach to communities that they don't traditionally reach, and we've helped provide tools along those lines. So it's been just a really powerful experience for us, and I think we've made some nice contributions around the countries, which I feel really proud of. It's been just a fascinating lesson in this work, though, and sort of there are four big lessons that we've learned from our international work that I think have enhanced our work in the United States. And these are pretty generic, so I think they'll apply to all of us. The first is the innovative adaptation of technology. Like, I think all of us know that mobile money, was not developed in this country, right? And it's such a powerful tool. But just the simple thing of text messaging, which is the most powerful tool out there to reach communities, right? And we are way behind the curve, or we're way behind the curve in this country when it comes to using text messaging to really activate communities. We've brought that to all the communities that we're working with, and most of them were already starting to use this really powerful tool. But even like 2 weeks ago in Texas, when the power grid failed, major media in Texas didn't know how to reach their communities anymore. And they were like discovering text messaging as if it didn't exist there. So I've just sort of say, well, there's so many interesting technology lessons that we can learn from our international work. The second is, because we work in so many diverse environments, we know there's no cookie cutter approach to anything a community is grappling with, that you need to go in and work together to co-create a solution to whatever challenges a community is facing. And when you work in a lot of diverse environments, you just automatically do that. But we find a lot of approaches in this country tend to be cookie cutters. Here's the solution, I'm going to bring it here. And so that's a really important lesson. Related to that is sort of the importance of partnership. We almost always work in partnership to advance whatever our solutions that we're trying to come with. Again, that's a value that we bring to our US programs. We don't always see it, and we think we should. The final one, and I know we want to get to other people, the final lesson is the value of an outside perspective. We went into Fresno to conduct an information ecosystem assessment, and folks there said, there's no way you can come in here and tell us, to understand who we're listening to, who's talking to, who the influencers are. And then after we went through this process with our community and our partners there, they said, there's no way we could have achieved what we did without your outside perspective. And so bringing an outside perspective is a really valuable and healthy thing. So those are my 4 lessons.
Fantastic lessons, Jeannie. Thank you so much. And I'm really struck as well because you talked about how InterNews became involved in U.S. work because you were asked to do it. And when I joined the International Youth Foundation, when I asked them, how did we start working in the U.S.? And they said, well, we were asked to do it. And there was the skepticism, though, of the communities, understandably, like, why are you, an international organization, coming into our community? And what was so rewarding, similarly to here in this case, it was in Chicago, a year later, as they were sitting around the table, the community organizations saying, we learned so much, but it was because you listened. And I think that approach that we take is so important to most of all, listen and act with humility. And so you really pulled, I think, a lot of that together really, really just so well. So thanks for sharing that. And now I'd like to turn to Tony, because, this big debate that has been raging in the US for some time about the global and economy, the cultural divide, the political impact of, the places left behind, which Tony, you and I used to talk about during breaks and meetings in USAID, we all of a sudden shift our focus from the international and say, boy, this is, what are we going to do here at home? And this debate that has been raging for so long. And so you now being at the Brookings Institution for the last 4 years have really been able to dive into particularly this issue of rural America and looking at the lessons with your 25 years of executive experience and working globally. What do you see are the core lessons coming out of this that you think should guide all of us as we move forward?
Yeah, thanks. It is great to be part of this conversation. So I just want to thank Interaction and the fellow panelists and you, Susan, for having this conversation, because my career has bounced from working on domestic issues and rural and economic and community development, as well as the time we spent together at USAID and at the State Department. And I see a lot of overlap in Venn diagram, but I don't see a lot of us as a field making those connections. So what we did when I came to Brookings, what I set out to do over the last year was to look at the federal policy and the federal programs that are available to rural areas for their social and economic development. But we did it through a lens of what we in the international space call development effectiveness. Like, what's the return on investment that we're getting from the investments that we are making? And from that perspective, we found over 400 programs scattered across the federal government, that's available to rural communities. And to Jeannie's first point, I think our first lesson was there's no one size fits all, right? And the way we approach these problems internationally is a very place-based approach, because we're very cognizant of the cultural and historical legacy and the sort of leadership that happens at the field level. That's not always the case, actually, domestically. And a lot of our federal programs are very much about one solution for one particular problem, sort of the one widget to solve that one problem. In fact, whereas overseas, especially through USAID, we don't do a lot of hard infrastructure funding. A lot of the funds that go to rural communities from the federal government in the US is basically that. It's hard infrastructure, which means that there's very little flexibility and very little investments in local leaders and local institutions and local capacity to sort of create locally led solutions and economies. And it's really interesting to me because that's very much that idea of local ownership and the principle of local ownership that we carried through in the Obama administration and then even in the Trump administration, the journey to self-reliance. That sort of thinking and the principles that underlie those is not necessarily commonly agreed upon or has a common set of vision that guides our federal policy on the domestic level, and especially for rural communities. So just even making more flexible the kind of interventions that we might have and supporting local leadership and that idea of partnership that Jeannie talked about, that is really what our rural communities are looking for. They realize that the shifts that they've experienced in the global and national economy means that they have to adapt and innovate, but they're very constrained to be able to find the support and the capacity that they need to be able to do that. And I think that's another thing that it's really interesting. When we think of rural, for example, and we think of the rural-urban divide, I mean, a lot of folks just get in their minds, they're thinking of a person that's either a white blue-collar worker or a farmer. And the fact is, rural America is exceptionally diverse. Communities of color comprise over 21% of the rural population. The economies are much more focused on service industry than when you think of agriculture. That also actually only makes up about 5% of rural employment in the US right now. And so this idea of opening up, and in fact, in the report and the analysis that we did, we sort of stole a page from the institutions that we've created over the last 15 years in international development in the US government, like the Millennium Challenge Corporation, like the US Development Finance Corporation, and said, those are the types of institutions we actually need to be working domestically because they have the flexibility, the financing, and sort of the long-term purview for what rural communities are going to need to be able to thrive in the US.
Wow, that was fascinating, Tony. Just your insights from your years of obviously working in international development, but now, really diving deep into not only looking at it from a domestic policy perspective, but also rural America. I didn't mention that you grew up in rural Pennsylvania, so this isn't just something that is an academic exercise. This is really speaks to Tony's roots. And I can't think of it better than transition really to you, Sakira, because the lessons that Tony just shared with us on top of what Jeannie was just sharing with us from their work, internationally and thinking about, how can we not only apply some of these lessons here at home so that we, there is truly local ownership. I think that really important, the partnership piece of this, the flexibility that is so critical, whether working internationally and now working here at home, and the innovation of being able to tap into it. Would love to hear your perspective, not only on that, but also what would you like to say, Sakira, to international NGOs who you're speaking to today, who are saying, we want to be doing some work here in the US and we're not really sure how to go about it, particularly in the area of racial justice, and how can international NGOs, really help advance the mission and not really overtake the mission that you and your colleagues have worked on for your entire careers.
Thank you. I want to thank Interaction for inviting me to this important conversation, and to my colleagues for joining me on this panel. So my work at the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights is focus primarily on domestic policy with respect to federal, legislative, and administrative policy in the area of the criminal legal system and transforming that system through the lens of racial justice. But another aspect of the Leadership Conference's work globally and my work at the organization has been domestic implementation of human rights obligations that the United States has made, right? Especially treaty obligations that they have made in using international mechanisms as a way to not only elevate the cause of human rights here in the United States, but also to bring attention in the international sphere around the issues of racial justice in the US that also correlate heavily to work that's happening in other countries, right? Especially as it relates to the issues of police violence, the incarceration rates in the United States, and the disproportionate ways that Black and Brown people, especially in the United States, are treated by our criminal legal system. These are issues that are global in nature. We work with a lot of NGOs across the globe that are tackling police brutality in South America, right? In Brazil, in Colombia, in places across the country. In Europe, they're tackling racism and discrimination and the legacies of white colonialism, right? And how they have impacted the continent of Africa and African immigrants and also Caribbean immigrants who moved to Europe and live in Europe and have lived there for many, many centuries, but have often been erased from the culture and have not fully enjoyed human rights or sort of domestic rights there and what as well. So our work and my work has really been to bridge that gap and to often call our government to task, right, for its obligations here at home when we are often overseas. The United States is often overseas pointing the finger, saying you country are violating people's human rights, but they're doing the same thing here in the United States. And I think it's important for international NGOs to be a part of that clarion call, right, to be a part of not only advocating for human rights in other countries, but to also use, and I think it gives a level of credibility to say that we also recognize that our own country has not gotten this right, that our own country has not lived up to its highest ideals that we espouse in our Constitution. This idea of American exceptionalism is something that's, global in nature. Just look at the way that our foreign policy, the way that we operate with respect to foreign policy. And I think it's critical, especially at this juncture, where there, I think, is an awakening in our country around racial justice issues broadly, around the legacies of enslavement and white supremacy and how they continue to permeate systems and structures, whether we're talking about the criminal legal system or we're talking about poverty, right? or healthcare or housing or education in the United States. They have traditionally and systematically produce inequitable outcomes, especially for communities of color. And we see that across the globe, right? And we often see that even in countries that are predominantly African-American, or excuse me, Black or of people of color countries, because of the legacies of colonialism there, right? Which have its, sort of correlations to white supremacy in America. And so there are lots of ways that I think international NGOs can use the lessons and work with advocates here in the United States to not only share the work that is happening here and to provide lessons from NGOs here that are organizing social movements. And I know Maria will talk a lot about this, how they can use those lessons for advocacy across the world, right? In other countries across the world. And I think that's particularly important now. We're in the International Decade of People of African Descent, right? That decade is a global decade, right? Every country has agreed to address the issue of people of African descent across the globe. And the issues, like I said, that we are pushing against here, when I talk to colleagues in Spain or colleagues in Brazil or colleagues in the United Kingdom, especially around police violence, I'll use that as an example. They are facing some of the very same issues. That's why the Black Lives Matter movement has been able to become global. That's why you see these protests that have become global, and they're are, especially NGOs that are Black led, they are working in this way. They are not only working at home, but they are working across the globe and coordinating around strategy and ways to elevate. I'll say the last thing I'll point to is that for US-based NGOs in particular who work abroad, I think it's critical. I think it would help our work. It's critical for us to ensure that our own government, especially the State Department, is honest about their work, right? And I say that because it is often the case that the State Department is the primary, liaison to international mechanisms at the United Nations. But the State Department doesn't do any domestic policy work, right? They only do international work. And so their framework is very, centered on that. And our work has been to bridge the divide that exists within our country between the State Department, the Department of Justice, the Department of Health and Human Services, and every other administrative agency that works on domestic policy issues that can, provide the insight and the true accounting of what is happening here in the United States with respect to treaty obligations, with respect to, implementation of other human rights obligations that we've made. And so for us, I think working with NGOs internationally who see firsthand how the State Department shows up and being able to elevate the often, I think, contradictions that exist and how we show up in other countries and what's happening at home, I think is critical to moving all of our work forward collectively.
Well, that's just an amazing sort of lesson you just shared, I think, with everybody. One, that organizations like yours that are working here in the US, you're bridging the divide every day because you're just naturally networking with the globe. And I think, again, pointing out that paradigm shift, right? It's no longer international and US. Everyone's naturally globally working together. Secondly, that there truly has been an awakening in our country, finally. And I think, all of us around this virtual table would say this is a good thing. It doesn't mean it's easy. It's very hard, but there's a lot of work to be done. And I think that's partially why we're having this conversation, because third, as you said, there's a clarion call right now. We didn't talk about it, maybe we will in a bit, about, the decolonization of development is a debate, a discussion that's going on in the international development community and the white savior complex. And, how do we really address this and, again, sort of break down these silos and bridge them together and all of us work together as one global community, which I'm thrilled also you brought up the State Department, because I didn't mention in Maria's bio that she actually worked at the State Department a while ago before she went to the USIP and obviously is an expert in nonviolent movements. But, so having that sort of policy background, obviously, as well as working in nonprofits in the academic world, she really bridges a lot of different worlds. And so, Maria, I'd love for you now to just spend a couple minutes sharing with our audience, the lessons that you have taken away throughout your career and where you see us now, but particularly, what you think donors and governments. I mean, I think I really love the way that Secura framed that a bit, and what we can do also, all of us as policy advocates and folks who have worked in government or outside of government, and how we can help also those policy discussions and bridge that divide. So over to you, Maria.
Sure. Well, thank you, Susan, and it's great to be part of this interaction panel. And I think picking right up where Secura left off, I completely agreed with all of her points. I think, a general theme of this discussion is just that our foreign policy is really an extension of our domestic policy. And, you can't speak credibly, legitimately about human rights, democracy, peace, unless you're really focusing seriously on these things at home. And so, Secura was mentioning the social justice movements, which have been remarkable in this country. And really the history of progress in the United States is the history of movements. And I think that's a really important thing for foreign policy professionals to think about, is that, whether it was the movement to abolish slavery, whether it was the movement for women's suffrage, for civil rights, for environmental rights, worker protections, all of these were driven by people out on the streets, people who had protested, engaged in strikes, boycotts, civil disobedience, non-cooperation. Like, that's such a huge part of the history of our country. And, you know, this is how, like, the struggle in this country has been about voice and about participation and about who gets to be included in the decisions that affect their lives. And, like, that's so much about what movements are about, and movements around the world. And that's, you know, most of my professional life, whether it was in the US government at USIP, where I left recently, whether it was in the nonprofit sector as an academic and a researcher who studies civil resistance. Like, that's the powerful thing about movements, is that they create a sense of urgency. They really bring issues to light, whether it's, you know, about dictatorship, corruption, apartheid. Like, they really force, you know, people to pay attention and to take action. And I think, you know, we're in a moment, you know, with the Black Lives Matter protests and the movement for Black lives, you know, after George Floyd's murder, those were the largest protests and most persistent protests in US history, the Black Lives Matter protests. So this is significant, you know, in our country. And I think the huge opportunity exists to build bridges between these powerful domestic movements and the US foreign policy community. And to jump right to your question about what donors can do, I think helping to build these bridges and helping to promote dialogue, to convene conversations about these issues is really critically important. And I'm thinking about, you know, all of these movements: Black Lives Matter, the Poor People's Campaign, the youth-led Sunrise Movement for environmental justice, the feminist peace movement, veterans movements. Like, all of these are already bridging domestic and international policy. They're connecting it in their policy platforms. They're connecting it in how they advocate the use of resources. Like, should we be investing so many resources in war and militarism, or ought we not kind of reinvest them in community development here and internationally? And so I think there's just a great opportunity to, you know, engage with these movements, listen to them, and that could help kind of democratize US foreign policy in many ways, help give good ideas for actually how to do human rights and democracy work abroad, and help to just, like, make these connections real between domestic and foreign policy. So that would probably be my biggest kind of donor recommendation: to invest in the bridges, invest in the dialogue, invest, whether it's, you know, groups like InterAction convening conversations between movement leaders and members of the foreign policy community, invest in research. You know, just this, now's the moment to really put meat on the bones of connecting domestic and foreign policy. And, you know, donors could play a big role in helping make that happen.
Well, that is, those are really concrete recommendations, particularly for this audience and this forum of interaction, which in this interaction forum, I know we are having former policymakers, current policymakers, but it's going to be a consistent dialogue, and the importance of building those bridges, because what we're experiencing here, and particularly over this past year, I think has given everyone a sense of humility as we engage in our foreign policy, that you cannot really disconnect our foreign and our domestic policy, which then brings me to you, Tony, because, you know, you obviously led the post-2015 agenda as our special coordinator under the Obama administration. We have a new administration now, and it's dramatically changed. The world has changed. And so what would be your advice, particularly picking up on Maria's recommendations? She was recommending, particularly for forums like InterAction or donors in general, what would you recommend to the new administration to think about in terms of how do we move this forward? How do we break down these silos and bridge this divide? And with reference to the SDGs, because we have a huge opportunity. I know I don't need to convince you of that. It's our first global strategy. So take it away and tell us, what would you recommend to the new administration?
Well, one thing would just be to have the new administration take the SDGs seriously. So, you know, the US is the only G20 and OECD country that hasn't done a national review of where they are in the SDGs. So just even coming to play and saying, we're going to take these seriously. And, you know, there's a a risk of that falling into primarily the international side. And, you know, USAID and the State Department and MCC, they'll be able to see a policy framework in the SDGs that makes sense. You know, the countries that they work in are taking it seriously. That's how they're developing their national development plans. But I think what the US could really benefit from is saying, this applies to us domestically. Everything that's in the SDGs is reflected in the 4 pillars of the Build Back Better agenda of the Biden-Harris administration. You know, stopping COVID in its tracks, getting the economic recovery right coming out of COVID, addressing issues of systemic racism, and taking action on climate change. And those are all a big part of the SDGs. So thinking about it in those terms, I think actually would really supply the US as it starts to walk again into global fora where, frankly, countries are going to be welcoming us and they're going to be happy to see the US engage again, but they're going to have some ongoing skepticism. And they're going to wonder how consistent and dependable the US could be. By the US saying, look, we're looking at the SDGs, we're taking them seriously, and we're matching them up to our domestic agenda, gives us a bit of humility as we walk back into the global stage that can help us rebuild that credibility. And then I think the final points I would say on that is, like, look, when we were finishing up the SDGs, you know, when I was the special envoy at the UN, I was trying to get the Domestic Policy Council and the National Security Council to sort of work together and think together. To Maria and Sakira's point, that was pretty unusual. And that was not easy to do. But so taking it seriously means putting those different parts of the government together to start to think together and work together. And frankly, interaction members can be doing the same thing. There are interaction members like Save the Children, Oxfam America. They have programs in both places. My experience actually of a lot of those organizations is they are very siloed internally. There's not a great deal of exchange and thinking, even inside organizations like that, and certainly in the world of philanthropy that is funding globally as well as locally. So there's a lot of work that organizations, even in their own operations and in their own knowledge base and their own experience, can really be leveraging and taking advantage of.
All excellent points. You know, it's not just bridging our government, it's really bridging our organizations, bridging our knowledge. And again, you know, using forum like this in order to bring people together who don't normally have the opportunity, because all of a sudden when we're in a room together, it's like there are sparks flying because we're all learning from each other. And so very important points you make there. Jeannie, I'd like to come back to you because one of the things that, you know, everybody has mentioned and Tony just picked up on is as we engage in internationally, obviously our situation here at home affects the way we engage overseas. I had the good fortune of working with InterNews 20 years ago when I was in Russia, and you know, it was a very different environment back then. And so now, how do you do that? How do you? And I'd say, you know, many of our NGOs in the audience today, you know, they're working on these issues that we have some real problems here at home. So how do you approach that in today's environment?
Well, I will say, I just want to echo what the other panelists have been saying. The crises that faced the U.S. this year and the last couple of years really gives us an opportunity, I think, to re-engage with humility, because we are addressing all of these problems very directly. If you think about my sector in particular, the sort of the massive rise of disinformation around our entire country and how it's undermined our very democracy, the truth is we address it here the way we address it everywhere in the world. We have to roll up our sleeves and work really hard at rebuilding that trust in these institutions. We've got to do that here as well. We've got fact checking. We've got media and digital literacy things we're working on. We've got algorithm accountability that we need to focus on, the big platforms and their role in what's going on. We've got ways that we need to document misinformation, disinformation, so that we can hold the people who led that misinformation, disinformation to account for what they're doing. And from InterNews' perspective, needless to say, we need to invest in good quality information as the root solution to solving the disinformation problem. Just want to take 1 second on that platform accountability piece, though, because I think it does transcend a lot of our work as well. It is when we can say we in the US have to have the humility for the problems we have. We also have to recognize that we built some of those problems, and some of those problems are sitting in Silicon Valley, and it's incumbent on us, in my space in particular, in Silicon Valley, to hold those institutions that have such a giant influence on every community in the world, hold them to account for their role in undermining some of the progress that we're all representing as well. So when it's born here in our country, we also have to really take special attention on those types of challenges.
Thank you for raising that, Jeannie, and for sharing your experience, because it has to be incredibly hard in today's environment. It's really recognizing, obviously, our own role as a country, and whether it's the private sector, the public sector that we're playing globally. And Secura, just thinking about that, and I'm sure there are INGOs in the audience who would love to start being able to do some work here at home. And this issue of humility, or the white savior complex, or however you want to think about it. What advice would you have? Because it is top of mind. And so we'd love to hear from your experience. What have you seen that has been most effective and people should be keeping in mind as they're starting to lead their organizations to engage in US work?
So I would say, post the George Floyd's murder and the sort of summer of protests that went into the fall, there were a number of organizations, corporations, civil rights organizations, traditional civil rights and human rights organizations that started to reevaluate internal policies and practices, right? And their own cultures, even if they were saying, on the outside, I'm a civil rights organization, we wouldn't do things like that. But, even at the leadership conference, I often have to remind us that our own internal policies and culture have to mirror, what we say externally, right? If we have a policy, I'll just use this example because it's a very real example. We have a policy around background checks and the ways in which background checks have left people with arrest and conviction histories out of the employment process because of that, right? Stigma that is associated with a criminal conviction. And our policy is to say you should not do a background check until after the conditional offer stage of employment, until after you've looked at the person on the merits and said that they are qualified. And then after that, if you do a background check and something comes up, you have to do an individualized assessment. Mm-hmm. And so that is our public facing policy. I advocate for that in law and policy in the United States. But in our organization, I also had to go back and say, wait a minute, is that our internal policy? Like, does our internal policy, because I don't know, I'm not the HR person, is our internal policy sort of reflecting that? And so in this moment, I think it's important for international NGOs to do some of that self-assessment first, right? Don't go and say, hey, teach me how to be a better racial justice advocate. No, start to look internally and say, okay, what are we doing? How is our internal culture reflecting, the privilege, holding up sort of whiteness and privilege as a primary thing? Do we have a diverse staff? Are we recruiting in a diverse way? Are we bringing in people that have diverse perspectives and experience to guide our thinking, not only internationally, but domestically? And what partnerships exist? Have we talked to, leading racial justice organizations about how to better do this work instead of trying to figure it out ourselves first, right? Have we done listening sessions? I mean, I thought Jenny's, sort of examples were really important, especially around New Orleans, hearing from people directly about what it is they feel and think. Because often I find is the case that organizations don't actually talk to their staff. They don't, they don't actually ask them, hey, what is our culture to you? How do you feel in this culture? How can we do better, first? And then, go from there. So I would say that is a great first step, is to do some self-reflection about the ways in which institutionally your organization has or has not been upholding, sort of colonialist ideals or, practices unintentionally, I would imagine, right? And so it's that unconscious bias that we always have to check ourselves against, always. I mean, every one of us, no matter who we are, especially from a place of privilege. So.
Oh, great recommendation, and I think a great way to wrap this up. I can't believe how quickly these 45 minutes flew. But you know, this point that you're making, Sakira, I think to all of us in the NGO world, and at this forum, to first look inside, to reflect, to listen locally, as Jeannie was saying, to be flexible and adaptable, as Tony was saying, and to look at those tools, and as Maria was emphasizing, knowing we've been working in global movements, you know, for some time. So this is a moment in time. Let's step back, let's pause, and let's seize the moment that we all have now to work together as one community. So I just want to close by thanking each of you for not only your time, but just your tremendous insights that you're sharing with the Interaction community. So thanks again so much, and have a wonderful day, everyone.
Thank you. Thanks so much.